Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, the American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on war work, exclusion, and citizenship on the home front. The core question is this: what kind of citizenship exists when the same wartime state opens defense jobs for some workers and removes other citizens from their homes behind military orders? The core competency is to cite examples of salient changes to American society that resulted from her commitment to the Allied war effort. What kind of citizenship exists when the same wartime state opens defense jobs for some workers and removes other citizens from their homes behind military orders? Total war demanded workers, housing, transport, food, steel, aircraft, uniforms, ammunition, and ships on a scale no peacetime economy had attempted. The War Production Board converted industry, the War Manpower Commission allocated labor, and factories from Detroit to Richmond recruited aggressively. Mobilization widened opportunity, but access to that opportunity was filtered through race, gender, ancestry, and local political power from the beginning. Before Pearl Harbor, A. Philip Randolph had already forced the issue. His threatened march on Washington in 1941 pushed Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, barring discrimination in defense industries and government training programs, and creating the FEPC to investigate complaints. The order did not end discrimination, but it established a federal expectation that wartime production could not completely ignore Black access to jobs. Black newspapers and activists tied that pressure to the Double Vive campaign, linking victory abroad to equality at home. Women's work shifted under similar pressures. Rosie the Riveter symbolized millions entering defense plants and shipyards. Yet employers often confined women to specific jobs, paid them less, and assumed the change was temporary. Black women and Mexican-American women were frequently concentrated in lower-paid sectors, while domestic service remained a fallback where industrial access was blocked. The same emergency that opened plants and pay envelopes also gave the state arguments for surveillance, exclusion, and confinement. The social map of the war years changed because labor moved. African Americans continued the second Great Migration from the rural South into western and northern cities. Black workers left sharecropping regions in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas for shipyards in California, steel in the Great Lakes, and aircraft assembly in Washington state. White Southerners moved as well, carrying regional customs into crowded industrial centers. Housing shortages produced trailer camps, segregated neighborhoods, inflated rents, and conflict over access to public services. Detroit's 1943 riot, which left dozens dead and revealed sharp competition over jobs and residential space, belonged to the same wartime pattern as the better-known images of patriotic production. Industrial expansion did not dissolve local hierarchies. It concentrated them in places where money, transportation, and shelter were already under strain. Federal housing policy showed how incomplete the response was. The Lanham Act of 1940 authorized defense housing and community facilities, yet local implementation often reproduced segregation through separate projects, uneven access, and municipal resistance to integrated occupancy. In Mobile, Richmond, and Detroit, yards and plants expanded faster than paved roads, sewer lines, streetcar capacity, and family housing. Black workers could be recruited into bomber plants or shipfitting gangs and still be blocked from nearby neighborhoods by restrictive covenants, violence, or local housing boards. When the Sojourner Truth Housing Project in Detroit became a flashpoint in 1942, the conflict made plain that war labor demand did not cancel white resistance to Black residential access. The state could build aircraft and Liberty ships quickly. It moved far more slowly when housing policy challenged local racial order. The Bracero program added another migration corridor. In August 1942, the United States and Mexico created a bilateral labor agreement to bring Mexican workers into American agriculture and railroad maintenance. Contracts promised transportation, minimum wage protections, housing standards, and a return home after the job term, but enforcement varied sharply by region. Growers and railroads valued braceros because military service and industrial recruitment had drained existing labor pools. Workers entered through reception centers, medical examinations, and contract processing before being sent to fields and rail lines in Texas, California, Arizona, and beyond. The program tied wartime labor need to federal regulation. Yet Mexican and Mexican-American workers still faced racial profiling, segregated facilities, and wage abuse. Wartime necessity gave them entry into the labor market, while local practice narrowed the legal guarantees written into the contracts. Processing itself was labor control.
Men were assembled in central Mexican recruiting points, examined by physicians, fingerprinted, issued contracts, and moved by rail to border transfer stations before assignment north. Some contracts reserved a portion of pay in savings accounts to be released in Mexico, creating another lever over mobility and return. Railroad braceros were especially important in track maintenance crews because wartime freight traffic ran at high volume between farms, ports, and military depots. The promise on paper included sanitary housing, transportation, and fixed wages, but camp conditions varied from usable barracks to improvised quarters near fields and yards. Federal inspectors existed, yet growers and contractors often operated far from effective supervision. Japanese Americans faced a harsher state response. After Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese prejudice on the West Coast merged with military fear, local economic rivalry, and pressure from politicians and farm interests. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order itself did not name Japanese Americans, but it authorized the Secretary of War and military commanders to designate military areas and exclude any persons from them. General John L. DeWitt of the Western Defense Command then used that authority to impose exclusion across coastal areas of Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona. Families received numbered instructions, sold property at heavy loss, stored belongings with neighbors when possible, and reported to assembly centers at racetracks and fairgrounds. From there, they were transferred to War Relocation Authority camps in places such as Manzanar, Tule Lake, Poston, Gila River, Hart Mountain, Minidoka, Grenada, Jerome, and Rower. About 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were removed, roughly two-thirds of them American citizens by birth. EO 9066 and EO 8802 illustrate opposite uses of wartime power. EO 8802 responded to black protests by opening a narrow federal door against labor discrimination. EO 9066 responded to fear and prejudice by widening federal coercion over a civilian population without individual proof of disloyalty. The agencies enforcing these policies produced opposite forms of wartime power. The FEPC gathered complaints, held hearings, and negotiated with contractors, but it had weak enforcement tools and faced resistance from Southern Democrats and business managers. The War Relocation Authority, by contrast, built an entire administrative system of removal, camp management, guard towers, permits, work assignments, schooling, and loyalty questionnaires. One wartime agency investigated exclusion from jobs, another organized mass confinement under military authority. A. Philip Randolph's threatened march showed how pressure from below could force federal action. He worked with labor and civil rights activists who understood that defense contracts created leverage. Black leaders then pressed beyond employment toward voting rights, desegregation, and equal treatment in the armed forces. The Double V campaign, published in the Pittsburgh Courier, framed wartime service as a test of democracy's honesty. Black soldiers served in segregated units, including the Tuskegee Airmen, and hundreds of thousands of support personnel, while their families confronted discrimination in plants, neighborhoods, and military communities. Wartime service therefore strengthened a political language that would carry into the post-war civil rights movement. The FEPC's operating limits help explain both the opening and the frustration. It could receive petitions, summon employers, hold public hearings, and threaten bad publicity against contractors taking federal money, but it lacked the automatic sanction power that later civil rights agencies would claim. In 1943, Congress renewed it only after political struggle, and Southern committee chairs kept pressing to weaken appropriations. Even so, investigators traveled to aircraft plants, foundries, shipyards, and railroad facilities to examine hiring lists, seniority rules, and segregated job ladders. Black workers used that machinery strategically by filing complaints that forced companies to justify exclusions already embedded in union agreements or foreman's customs. Mexican-American citizenship was tested in urban space as much as in contract labor. The Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles during June 1943 began after rising tension between servicemen, police, and Mexican-American youths whose dress and style had already been targeted as unpatriotic or delinquent. Sailors and soldiers moved through the city beating youths, stripping clothing, and humiliating victims, while police often arrested the attacked rather than the attackers. The episode exposed how wartime nationalism could merge with racial policing and local moral panic. City officials treated style, mobility, and neighborhood presence as signs of disorder at the same moment that defense plants depended on Mexican and Mexican-American labor. The chronology sharpened the pattern. After the 1942 Sleepy Lagoon case had already cast Mexican-American youth as criminal in the Los Angeles press, conflict intensified around downtown streets, movie houses, and transit routes used by servicemen on leave. Violence spread over several nights in early June 1943 before Naval Command and city officials moved to contain it. The city council eventually banned the wearing of zoot suits in some public discussion, a sign that authorities still treated clothing and youth presence as the problem rather than mob assault or selective policing. Wartime citizenship remained subject to local police power even where federal labor needs were unmistakable. The legal test of Japanese American exclusion reached the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus United States in 1944. Fred Korematsu had refused to comply with exclusion orders and challenged the legality of the policy. The court upheld the exclusion order by a 6-3 vote, accepting the government's wartime necessity claim. Justice Hugo Black wrote for the majority, while dissents by Justices Roberts, Murphy, and Jackson warned against legalized racism and the danger of validating broad military claims against citizens. The decision did not endorse every camp practice in explicit terms, but it gave constitutional cover to exclusion based on ancestry during wartime. At the same time, Japanese American soldiers in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion fought in Europe with distinction, showing the contradiction between military service and family incarceration in the same national emergency. EO 9066 is a short document, and that brevity was part of its strength. Roosevelt signed language authorizing the War Secretary and military commanders to create zones from which any or all persons may be excluded and to provide transportation, food, shelter, and other accommodations. The order never used the words Japanese American, citizen, or race. That omission gave the order much of its force. Inked in general administrative language, the order looked broad, neutral, and military. In practice, it handed federal officials a legal lever for mass removal on the West Coast. That is how the document worked as a weapon. By avoiding explicit racial labeling on the page, the administration made selective enforcement easier to defend in court and easier to administer through posted notices, curfew orders, and removal schedules. West Coast Japanese Americans were treated as a population category, while German and Italian aliens moved through different and more individualized systems. The order's paper neutrality masked the fact that ancestry had become the sorting principle. Those exact words were chosen because they gave commanders range, gave departments cover, and gave later defenders a cleaner text than the policy's actual enforcement deserved. Placed against EO 8802, the contradiction hardens. EO 8802 used presidential authority to pry open defense employment after A. Philip Randolph threatened a march on Washington. EO 9066 used presidential authority to close movement, property control, and ordinary due process protections under military command. Removal then became tangible through baggage limits, assembly centers, rail transport, barracks, mess lines, fences, and guard towers managed by the War Relocation Authority. The language of military areas opened the door, but the state turned that phrase into a lived system of exclusion that reached into homes, farms, storefronts, and citizenship itself. The home front left uneven results that did not end in 1945. Wartime migration redistributed black voters, union members, and community leaders across northern and western cities, while women's industrial work altered household expectations even when many were pushed out after servicemen returned. The FEPC did not survive intact, but it established a federal precedent for employment rights claims tied to national policy. The Bracero program continued after the war and kept shaping labor politics in the Southwest. Japanese American confinement left deeper scars measured in farms lost, businesses liquidated, schooling interrupted, health damaged, and trust in government broken. The camps closed in 1945 and 1946, but return often meant hostility and poverty, while Korematsu remained a warning about judicial deference during emergencies. At the same time, military service by the 442nd and other units strengthened arguments that citizenship could not be ranked by ancestry without exposing the weakness of the policy that had confined their families. The GI Bill added another uneven result. On paper, it promised education loans and unemployment support to veterans. In practice, local banks, colleges, and housing authorities distributed those benefits through segregated institutions, redline neighborhoods, and unequal lending. The war expanded federal social capacity while allowing local inequality to shape who actually received the gains. That is why the home front cannot be closed with patriotic balance. The state widened participation, moved labor, built precedent for later rights claims, and at the same time, organized exclusion through ancestry, race, and local hierarchy. The unresolved judgment is whether a democracy at war can claim moral authority abroad when its own emergency machinery keeps deciding which citizens are protected, which are useful, and which can be sacrificed to fear.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.